Right. Good morning, everybody. This is Supervisor Donna Price from the Magisterial District of beautiful Scottsville, Virginia. And I'm also the Vice Chair of the Albemarle County Board of Supervisors. And we want to welcome you to our roundtable this morning. We have a great panel here. We've got Charlie Burton, Lisa Green, Amy Sarah Marshall, and V. Lamneck. And so at this point, what I'd like to do is let each of our panelists introduce themselves. And Charlie, we'll start with you.
Hey everybody, my name is Charlie Burton. I'm a native of Charlottesville and Albemarle County. Wear a lot of different hats. I am a founding board member of Black Trans Men Incorporated and also a newly recycled back member for Charlottesville Pride.
Thank you, Charlie. And Lisa Green.
Hi, I'm Lisa Green. I am an employee at Albemarle County and the chair of the Albemarle County LGBTQIA Affinity group. And I am also on the board of Charlottesville Pride.
All right. Thank you, Lisa. Amy Sarah Marshall.
Yeah, my name is Amy Sarah Marshall. I'm the founding president of the Charlottesville Pride Community Network and happy to be here.
Thank you, Amy Sarah. And V. Lamneck, who is muted.
Good morning. Hello. So happy to be here. My name is V. Lamneck. I use they and them pronouns, and I am the executive director of Equality Virginia. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, V. And I should have mentioned, I use female pronouns. I'm transgender. And it's great to have you here with us today. And V, thank you especially. Equality Virginia has done so much for us. Not just locally or even statewide, but you've helped lead the nation towards a better place for all of us. We're going to talk today about some recent legislation in Virginia, but before we do, I'd like to kind of take a step back. In the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title VII prohibits employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Now, that's employment law. And we're going to expand upon that a little bit later. And in a little bit tongue-in-cheek, I want to give a thanks to Howard W. Smith, former congressman, UVA law grad. He was chair of the House Rules Committee when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was being proposed. He was a strong opponent to civil rights legislation, an ardent segregationist. He was a signatory of the 1956 Southern Manifesto that opposed desegregation of public schools after the Supreme Court decision of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And he actually delayed the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 for a while. And then 2 days before it was coming up for a vote, he's the one who inserted the word sex into the categories for which discrimination was going to be prohibited. Little did he know that one day, a day very recently in our time, the Supreme Court of the United States, in the case of Gerald Lynn Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia, there are other cases that were all tied in here together, but that's the one it will be known as, Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia, actually finally interpreted the word sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity. And let me just tell you a little bit of the facts of that case if you haven't had a chance to look at it. Mr. Bostock worked for Clayton County, Georgia as a child welfare advocate. Under his leadership, the county won national awards for its work. And after about a decade with the county, he began participating in a gay recreational softball league. This resulted in some influential members of the community speaking out against him, and he was soon fired for, quote, conduct unbecoming a county employee. Very clearly he was fired. The core cause was the fact that he identified as a gay man. The Supreme Court in its decision ruled that Title VII prohibits employers from taking certain actions because of sex. And that means but for. And the language of the law means that Title VII, because of test, incorporates the simple and traditional standard of but-for causation. And then the Justice Gorsuch, who wrote the majority opinion, a 6-3 decision, by the way, which was simply amazing, said that the statute's message for our cases is simple and momentous. An individual's homosexuality or transgender status is not relevant to employment decisions. That's because it is impossible to discriminate against a person for being homosexual or transgender without discriminating against that individual based on sex. And so that was a momentous decision, but let's remember, it only applies to employment discrimination. In case the justice went on to state that we're not talking about bathrooms or locker rooms or dress codes. Those are not before the court today. Under Title VII, we do not purport to address these issues. The only question before us is whether an employer who fires someone simply for being homosexual or transgender has discharged or otherwise discriminated against that individual because of the individual's sex. And that really leads us to where we're going today, which is what has happened recently in Virginia with the passage of a number of bills. When we look at sex discrimination, particularly as involves LGBTQIA plus individuals, what we can really start the history with is on April 27th, 1953, when President Eisenhower issued Executive Order 10450, which basically prohibited the employment of homosexual individuals. This was well before we had the alphabet. Prohibited the employment of individuals in the federal government or for any company that had any contract with the federal government. And that is what we have had to deal with until just within the last week or so, the Bostock case coming out. Now what we've got is, under the great leadership of Equality Virginia, their activism and the support of countless individuals around the state, we have seen the passage of a number of bills instrumental to equality under the law for LGBT individuals. And so at this point, I'd like to turn it over to V. Lamneck and ask if she could give us a bit of a summary of some of that legislation that has just been passed that is truly historic. So V, over to you.
Thanks, Donna. Yeah, definitely happy to talk about this really momentous year that we had. And I would be remiss if I did not thank just the multitude of individual advocates, of organizations who really came together year after year to share their stories, to express why these protections were needed. This is really just a true achievement of all of Virginia's LGBTQ Virginians and their families and allies. It was really, truly a beautiful kind of statewide team effort. So very, very grateful to have worked with so many folks again, and truly over the years to create this possibility where Virginia is truly leading the South when it comes to LGBTQ equality. And we hope we're setting a good blueprint for our sister states here in the South as they continue their work as well to create more LGBTQ equality. So this year, we actually passed quite a few, over a dozen LGBTQ specific bills past the General Assembly. And rather than going into each of those individually, I thought it could be helpful to just break them down into just some kind of overarching sections. If you're interested in learning more about each of those individual bills, you are welcome to go to the equalityvirginia.org website. And our homepage, you'll see a card linking to our legislative victories for 2020. So I encourage you to check that out and learn more, because this is going to be a little cursory kind of overview. But I think first and foremost, just want to sit for a second on non-discrimination protections. And I think in many ways, this has been the work that Equality Virginia has been probably most known for, our advocacy efforts there. And again, our partnerships and coalition with individual advocates and groups across the state. So many people kind of coming together to help protect LGBTQ people from discrimination. And I will say that our work there to end discrimination against LGBTQ people was a bit of a double-edged sword, because oftentimes people in Virginia did not realize that it was perfectly legal to discriminate against someone on the basis of their sexual orientation or their gender identity when it came to employment or housing or public accommodation. So, service in a restaurant or hotel, something like that. It was completely legal. And so we found that we had a lot of education to do on the front end to let people know that this was still happening in Virginia. And then, of course, once we were able to educate folks, people really were activated and engaged and wanting to do what they could to help protect their LGBTQ friends, family, coworkers, neighbors from discrimination in housing and employment and public spaces. So again, we would not be where we are today without all of that individual advocacy, without hundreds and thousands of people contacting their legislators and sending in emails, making phone calls, coming down to Richmond to meet with their legislators in person to really advocate for these protections. Super, super important. So again, just want to shine some light and give credit where credit is due to our amazing community partners and advocates across the Commonwealth who raise their voice and let Virginia legislators know that they wanted to protect LGBTQ people from discrimination. And so this year, we collaborated with several other national organizations actually to create the Virginia Values Coalition. And so we worked in partnership with the Human Rights Campaign, HRC, the National Center for Transgender Equality, and Freedom for All Americans as part of a steering committee to really help move the Virginia Values Coalition forward. And I would be remiss to say if I didn't also include that coalition included dozens of faith leaders, over hundreds and hundreds of business leaders, both small businesses and large Fortune 500 companies, just many people very publicly advocating for these protections. So the Virginia Values Coalition worked together with Senator Adam Eben and Delegate Mark Sickles to create the Virginia Values Act. And so that piece of legislation in and of itself focuses on banning discrimination against LGBTQ people in housing and employment and public accommodations. So public spaces like, again, shops, restaurants, anywhere basically that a member of the public can expect to go and receive services, a park, for example. And we were really proud to work in partnership with this coalition to pass the Virginia Values Act. And many other legislators actually also had their own independent bills that we actually kind of folded into the Virginia Values Act. So also want to give a shout out to Senator McClellan and Senator Boysko and Delegate McQuinn for their wonderful advocacy and for patroning their individual non-discrimination bills. And then they became actually chief co-patrons of the Virginia Values Act and supported those efforts by Senator Adam Eben and Delegate Mark Sickles. So happily, with that passage, Virginia becomes the first state in the South to have non-discrimination protections in place for LGBTQ people in employment and housing and public spaces. So you can't be fired because you are gay or lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. You can't be denied housing. You can't be denied service. And this is huge because, again, in our advocacy work, we spoke with dozens and dozens and dozens of people who had experienced discrimination personally, or we spoke with family members who were fearing for their child's well-being and safety, their partner's well-being and safety. So again, thanks to that advocacy, we were able to really move this through, and again, under the leadership of Senator Eben and Delegate Sickles. Additionally, speaking of, still under the umbrella of non-discrimination protections, Delegate Mark Levine patroned House Bill 1049, and that updates Virginia's code and adds basically sexual orientation and gender identity protections to over a dozen other places in Virginia's code that address non-discrimination protection. So that continues to codify these protections even further into law. So we're very glad to see that happen as well. Additionally, Delegate Danica Rome sponsored House Bill 696, and that allows individual cities and counties to pass their own non-discrimination ordinances with the the passage of the Virginia Values Act that becomes less necessary, but is still important if localities decide to do something like that. They have that authority to do so. And then additionally, Delegate Rome also sponsored House Bill 1429, and that addresses health insurance and prohibits health insurance companies from discriminating against transgender Virginians specifically. And we were very happy to work in partnership with our colleagues at the Virginia League for Parenthood to move that legislation forward. So that's non-discrimination protections in a nutshell. That is a lot. That is a lot to kind of digest. But again, it was kind of a watershed moment in Virginia this year when it comes to these protections.
Thank you, Dee. That was a great
Of course.
summary. I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Well, I also, I can keep going, but I also don't want to take up too much airtime. So you let me know, Donna.
Yeah, Dee, let's let some other panelists have some comments. And I'm just going to say, when Equality Virginia started your Transgender Advocacy Speakers Bureau 4 or 5 years ago, I didn't fully appreciate the significance and breadth of conversation that would take place. I know I personally have gone to a number of churches and other faith groups and had a real opportunity in a safe place for the attendees to open up a discussion. And whoever it was that Equality Virginia came up with that idea, it was just momentous. Let me turn it over to some of our panelists. Lisa, how about you taking a few minutes and give us your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Donna. So as I look at this, as someone who's been in local government for a while, the questions I have, and V, this is where some of this started, is we know that in the Commonwealth of Virginia, you have to have an enabling authority, which the state legislation has to pass laws in order for local governments to then be able to pass the laws for non-discrimination, for instance. So my question, and I look at this and I understand that the overarching law that is passed, one, by our ruling by the Supreme Court last week, but and also by the legislation that was passed by Senator Adam Eben and Mark Sickles, that kind of is the law of the land at this point. But as you know, some of the localities that are not as inclusive, is there a way for them to pass discrimination laws at this point? Do you know how that would work? And also, I wonder what ordinances we need to change in our local government, city, counties, whatever, with Mark Levine's, with Danica Ream's House Bill 696 allows cities and counties to pass their own non-discrimination. Will that have to be enacted for some of these protections to be in place?
Thanks, Lisa. I'll jump in real quick. Turn it over to you. First off, for those who are watching, Virginia is what's called a Dillon rule state, and Lisa just referenced that. And the Dillon Rule provides that local governments are only able to pass legislate or ordinances, which is legislation, based upon what the state government has authorized them to do. And so now, for example, with one of the acts that was passed, local jurisdictions can pass their own anti-discrimination statutes. So we really weren't able to do that prior to being granted that authority. And in terms of any county ordinances, I know that I have contacted our county attorney, Mr. Greg Campner, and his office will be checking to see if there are any local ordinances that will require any revision. I don't have an answer to that at the moment. Candidly, I would be a bit surprised if there are any that that we really have of any significance in Albemarle County, but I can imagine that there might be some other locations that might have more work to do. So I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thank you for letting me throw in that little comment.
Of course, of course. So fantastic question. And Donna, thanks for giving that additional context. I think what I just want to pause here and say is that what's important is that just because the law has been passed doesn't mean necessarily that people do feel welcome or safe to come out, even though the law protects them from discrimination in employment and housing and public services, public spaces, that people still might experience unwelcoming environments, perhaps. And so I understand that there is, a little fear about, implementation. And what does that really look like? It's one thing to have a law in place that says that you are protected from discrimination, but what does that look like in individuals' day-to-day lives? So to answer your question, Lisa, the fact of the matter is that as of July 1st, the Virginia Values Act goes into law. And so if you are discriminated against in a job because of your gender identity or your sexual orientation, that is illegal. Doesn't matter if you live in Botetourt County or Virginia Beach or Fairfax or Albemarle. I mean, it is illegal no matter where you live. I think what is important here is to think about how are localities, you asked about, what can we do here in Albemarle to get ready? And I think lots of the advice that I've been hearing from folks is that, educate, update your policies, create a process in your HR protocol so that if somebody does feel like they've experienced discrimination, do people know internally the steps that they need to take? Have you done a training? Do people understand what it means by sexual orientation and gender identity? Some, different folks are in different places when it comes to their learning. So, I would recommend a training as well. And then posting this information as well in a public space, public place, around the water cooler, so that the information is publicly available, that the Virginia Values Act is in effect, and that means no discrimination against LGBTQ people in housing, employment, and public spaces.
So you talked about implementation. I'm sorry, Donna. You were talking about the implementation. Who will people call if they feel like as if they've been discriminated against? I mean, and I guess that's where this kind of the rubber meets the road on this is, okay, we had this protection, now what?
So the Virginia Division of Human Rights is currently tasked with helping to enforce to enforce this. And so the Virginia Values Act empowers the Division of Human Rights to investigate and issue recommendations when someone files a complaint of discrimination against them. They can actually file suit on behalf of somebody who complains. In addition, after someone files a complaint with the Division of Human Rights, that person can file suit against those who discriminated against them. And so that person, maybe seeking compensatory or punitive damages and attorney fees and costs. So, so that is a track. I will say that government employees may need to go through an employment grievance process if they have experienced discrimination. And I will also say that the Office of the Attorney General is also, creating a process as well, so that it's really clear for folks what they need to do once they've experienced discrimination. But the fact of the matter is, as of July 1st, if someone has experienced discrimination, that is illegal.
I think
Thank you, V.
hey, Donna, one last thing. Can we make sure that we post any contact information so that folks have that in case they need that in the future?
Well, I think in terms of, there's several things. One, Charlottesville Pride, of course, can post some of that. In terms of information through the county, I would simply ask that you submit it. There's a process that we go through before anything would be posted on the website, our community public engagement. But clearly, this is the type of information that would be very helpful.
Thank you.
I want to take a public service announcement and remind everyone that today is primary election day. Make sure you get out to the polls and vote. As important as this legislation is, we must also remember that it is legislation, and legislation can be changed by a different legislature and a different governor. So every vote counts. It's important to be out there. I'm hopeful that the Equal Rights Amendment, which recently was passed in Virginia, will soon become the law of the land, and that will give us even more protection, as it will be a constitutional provision. Right now, I'd like to turn it over to Charlie Burton. And Charlie, could you share a little bit about your experiences and how this may impact you?
I can share with you that I guess it was probably, Amy and Lisa could help me, probably 8 or 9 years ago. I did, for the first time, a booth at Pride when it was still at the infamous park. I don't even say the name of it, just the park. But I was interviewed by a local newspaper, and the next day, the interview was on the front page of the Sunday paper, and I was working a pretty decent job. I won't even say the name of the company here in Charlottesville, and I was off on Mondays, and so when I returned back to work on Tuesday, there was the newspaper on the table in the break room face up. I went to my desk, and one of the co-workers came over and said that she was going to pray for me. So I kind of figured something was getting ready to go on. And the long story short, by the end of that day, I had been told that they no longer needed my services. I was one of the top performers on that job. At that particular time, I felt like I didn't have a leg to stand on. So I was let go of that job, and it was probably 6 months later I found out why I was let go. But we didn't have this legislature here to be able to protect me, and I've had that fear ever since. Every job that I go on, my current job, I was told by a coworker about a month and a half ago that it had been announced by someone I don't even know that works for with my company that I was transgender. And that whole fear came back that I was, possibly going to be fired, but I was not. My boss was very kind and loving, already knew. And this time I felt protected because of where we moved from 8 or 9 years ago to where we are now. Growing up here and transitioning here has not been the most easiest feat, and I've thought many times of just moving and starting a new life, but this is my home. This is where I want to educate people that I'm different. I am who I was supposed to be, but I'm the same person who I need to be treated with dignity. So I look at this legislature and I look at this what's going on as a positive impact, and I think we need to get out here and educate people more so that they won't be me walking across the parking lot with a banker's box in my hand, knowing that I was fired because I was trying to live my authentic self.
Charlie, thank you for sharing that very painful story. I know my experience 25 years in the Navy every day, knowing that if the military found out that I even thought I was transgender, I would have been involuntarily discharged and the basis would have been sexual perversion, even if I had never done anything. And I was very excited when I saw under the previous presidential administration that military service for transgender individuals had been opened up. And then, of course, the rug was pulled right out from under those individuals under the current administration, which is a reminder that the battle is not yet over. We still must fight for equal rights for everyone. Amy, Sarah, you've got some comments here, I think, that are very relevant to what we're discussing.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to note that often, so I am also privileged to run Safe Seaville, which is a training program that we offer for businesses and organizations where we cover the information, the basics of sexual orientation and gender identity and what that means in terms of how do you make an inclusive culture. So whether we have the laws or not, how do you as a business make sure that you are being inclusive to everybody who's both employed and your clients? And one of the things that we have noted is that people are surprised to hear stories like Charlie's. And yet we've seen it happen almost every festival we've had where somebody gets outed, whether it's in the paper or some other venue, and walks in the next day to find out that they don't have a job. And so this definitely is a huge win. And yet I do want to remind people that yes, this was completely legal to do. My question for V, thinking about how this works for businesses, for our businesses in Charlottesville and Albemarle, what is the size of the business? Does this affect all like small and large businesses? And then also like, and especially we can think about Charlie's story. How do you think about, how do you prove the discrimination? So if you feel like you're being discriminated against in your workplace, or you get fired, which is more tangible, what can somebody do, I guess, is my question, as an individual employee to note what's going on, or or is it just call a lawyer? And what if you can't afford a lawyer? And then this part two to that is what do employers need to think about right now in terms of making sure that they're not discriminating, because they may be doing it without realizing it. So that's a lot of questions, but I was just thinking about those two things and how it can be murky. Thank you.
Hey, so I just wanted folks to know that this is a lot of content for sure. And unless you're taking notes, this might feel a little bit overwhelming. So for the folks who are thinking that this feels like a lot and want some additional information, I just want you all to know that we have worked with, Equality Virginia has worked with the lawyers that we partnered with, again, through the Virginia Values Coalition, to provide some additional information about the Virginia Values Act. There's so many questions because it's a big, complex piece of legislation. So of course, there's tons of questions. And Equality Virginia, again, is going to be sharing additional information with folks about what this means. So if you haven't been taking notes, or if this feels like a lot, don't worry. We're going to be sending out like an FAQ page so that if you have specific questions, again, about enforcement, about the number of employees that are covered, you'll have the information right at your fingertips. And you'll be able to access that on the Equality Virginia page by July 1st, if not a little bit sooner, but definitely by July 1st. So in terms of employers, this applies to private employers who have 15 or more employees. In addition, all state government employees and school board member employees will also be protected as well. even if the agency has less than 15 employees. So there are definitely some provisions in there about numbers of employees. I'm sorry, Amy, Sarah, I was just focusing on that number question, and certainly
That's
don't want to
okay.
take up, definitely.
I was just thinking for individuals who are employed and they feel like they're being discriminated against, like, what's the burden of proof, or what would you advise people to do?
Sure, and we should talk about this in our FAQ page as well. But we recommend keeping a record in a secure place, like not at work, that details what happened, what was said, who witnessed it, what the consequences were, if any electronic communication or any documents related to the discrimination. Compile all of that information and keep it in a safe place. And then, contact an attorney. And again, often, attorneys will it's my understanding that attorneys will take cases and can be compensated through the damages that somebody may be seeking compensation for. So there are certainly avenues, like legal avenues, obviously, that people can take. But we definitely highly recommend people documenting that experience and then contacting an attorney. And Equality Virginia has been keeping for a few years now a list of attorneys who have indicated that they are LGBTQ friendly on our website. So that information is available for folks as well. But we certainly recommend, doing your due diligence and finding the right person for you in your case.
Thanks, Vee. I want to inform or remind our viewers, if you're watching via public input, we invite and welcome your comments and questions, which you are able to enter in the comments box to the right of the live stream screen. And I want to follow up on something that Vee just mentioned in response to Amy Sarah's question. And, basically think of the who, what, when, where, why, and how questions. If you have something that's taking place at work, just as Vee mentioned, you want to document what day, what time, what place, who was there, what happened, and make sure you keep that somewhere other than at work. Because if you happen to be terminated the way most businesses operate today, you are basically escorted off the property and you will not likely have access, at least to anything on any information technology system. And you may have a great deal of difficulty even getting some of your personal affairs. So things like that, you want to, make a copy, take it with you, and put it in a safe place at home. As y'all are all talking, it just reminds me of a number of the areas that I have faced discrimination that people don't think about. I've had doctors refuse to treat me, endocrinologists who refuse to prescribe my hormone replacement medication, gynecologists who would refuse to see me. When I was getting my birth certificate changed, I was born in Louisiana, and under the administration that was in office at the time I filed for my birth certificate change, their policy was to fight every single one of these birth certificate changes and leave me with a birth certificate that had no relation to who I am and how I'm living today. So many of these acts really go a long way to making life better for those of us who happen to be members of the LGBT community. One of the other things that we have to be very careful of, and I think, Lisa, you're the one who may have mentioned this, just because the law has been changed, or maybe Amy, Sarah, you did, doesn't necessarily mean people are going to feel comfortable and safe. They're going to want to see how people are moving forward on this. And I think this goes back to something that Vee and Equality Virginia did with their grassroots effort to help show people around the Commonwealth that we are just like anyone else. Our path may be a little different, but we simply want to be free to live as who we are. I'd like to open it back up to some of our panelists. We've got a question from a public input. How do the Virginia Values Act protections work with Fair Housing Act? So Vee, do you mind taking that one? How do the Virginia Values Act protections work with the Fair Housing Act?
Sure. So the Virginia Values Act updates actually the Virginia Fair Housing Act to include protections for renters and home buyers against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, or veteran status as well, actually. So this would protect individuals looking to buy a home, renters of a home or a building, like an office space, and then those also interacting with realtors as well.
Thanks, V. You know, one of the other areas that it seems somewhat simple, but in practice is often very difficult. And that is that very often we have antiquated laws on the books that governments then later on seem somewhat recalcitrant or reluctant to remove. So, you know, Virginia had the ban on marriage equality in their statutes. And what will happen now with legislation is that must be changed, because there are very few things that are more frustrating and aggravating for an individual to have someone throw a law at you that's on the books but is completely unenforceable. And so I really commend the action that's being taken to help clean up these antiquated laws that have no place in our society today. A couple of the other areas that I think are really important is the third gender marker option on your DMV license, because you know, we tend to think of the binary, and for those who are familiar with that language, you know, think about a computer, on or off. We think of the binary too frequently, male or female, boy or girl, you know, black or white, not realizing that there is an entire rainbow of colors and throughout society. And not everyone fits neatly into a boy or a girl box. And so, you know, it's really important now that people will have some of the additional options out there to really be able to identify in their paperwork who they actually happen to be. You know, some protections for LGBTQ youth in schools. You know, we've had several cases, you know, right here out of Virginia with protecting transgender individuals in schools. So, Vee, do you mind taking a few minutes and talking a little bit about the protections in schools?
Sure, sure thing. So protections in schools. So this session, we actually introduced a new bill. So for the first time, we looked at what it might mean, what it could look like to create guidance so that individual school districts really understood how to protect specifically their transgender students. So I'll back up a little bit and tell a story, because a lot of work, you know, went into where we are in this current moment. So we've been talking a lot about the power and authority that decision makers have at the local level, and that is certainly true when it comes to our independent school boards, or independent school boards. And we, Equality Virginia, have been working with those independent school boards. There's 132 independent school districts in Virginia, so quite a few. And Virginia's Department of Education is actually super decentralized, so that each of these individual school districts are making decisions that impact the students in those districts. So one of the things that those local school boards have the authority to do is to update their non-discrimination policies, to update their anti-bullying policies, to include non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ students and staff. And we've been working with, again, I mean, this work just isn't possible without local advocates on the ground, parents and educators and administrators, who really have been advocating to update these policies, because we know that policy update, especially in schools, is so incredibly important. We know that LGBTQ youth experience extremely high rates of discrimination and harassment and violence, so much so that many LGBTQ students don't perform as well as they could academically. It impacts their attendance and, again, their academic performance because of the discrimination and harassment and violence that they experience in schools. And so one of the ways to help mitigate that is to have policies in place. And so again, that's a lot of the work that Equality Virginia has been doing, again, in partnership with local advocates and students and educators and administrators on the ground in these localities. One of the things that often came back up in these conversations is that educators and school administrators, school board members were asking for additional support when it came to creating more inclusive learning environments for transgender students. They wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to have these protections in place, but they needed some additional support. They needed some additional information about what that looked like in practice. And so Equality Virginia spoke with Senator Jennifer Boysko and Delegate Marcus Simon, and they were very interested in introducing a bill in 2020. They introduced companion bills that would require the Department of Education to create guidance so that these local school districts would know how to create inclusive learning environments for transgender students. And we know when that happens, it predicts better outcomes for everyone, for all students. We're really, really excited about that. And so, the Virginia Department of Education is now looking at what that guidance might include. They've created a work group that Equality Virginia is part of, along with many other stakeholders from across the Commonwealth who are going to be, contributing ideas and suggestions and recommendations for what this guidance should include. What are the best practices when it comes to, again, creating inclusive learning environments for transgender students so that they can perform at their best, so that they can graduate with their peers. And so the Department of Education is required to craft a model policy by December 31st of 2020. And then that guidance will then be voted on and adopted by local school boards across the Commonwealth. And again, truly, this would not be possible without the advocates who've been voicing their support for this for years, but also our partner organizations like Side by Side, which is an LGBTQ youth center based here in Richmond, but they actually provide programming there in the Charlottesville region. He, She, Ze, and We is a parent support group for parents, families, caregivers of transgender children and young adults. PFLAG groups around the state have been partnering with us, in addition to many other advocacy groups, to advocate for this guidance. And we are just really excited that transgender students will be able to go to school and be able to participate fully, because this guidance will be in place.
And I just want to jump in, if you don't mind, and just for those who might be thinking, well, what's that about? I just want to say that Charlottesville Pride, we've heard lots of stories about kids of all ages experiencing discrimination here in Albemarle County and in Charlottesville schools for having teachers refuse to call them by the name that they need and want to be called by, being harassed by other students, and not feeling encouraged to or supported in their clothing expression, their gender expression. And this has been something that we have not had a way to, there's been no recourse, and it's been difficult. There are so many wonderful supportive principals and teachers and staff and counselors, but there's a lot of people who just are uninformed, and we've seen that happen throughout. And then Fluvanna, Louisa, Orange, we've heard similar, Greene County, similar stories where there just isn't an understanding of what it means for a kid to constantly hear the kind of harassing language that they will hear. And if you look statistically, there's been studies put out there that even though right now more and more youth are identifying as LGBTQ, so that we're looking at about 25% plus of Generation Z identifies within the community. At the same time, you have about 65, 85%. There's really high percentages of youth experiencing bullying, harassment, negative comments from teachers and staff about gender expression, about gender identity, sexual orientation, all of that on a daily basis. And so this is a very real problem, and it's something that happens here. We like in Charlottesville to think of ourselves in a very positive light and to not think this doesn't happen here, and it does. So.
You know, Amy, sir, you really brought up a very important point there, and that is, and it goes back to the whole commentary about the binary. You know, not everyone looks like a boy or looks like a girl. Using my own experience, and I am on the binary. I lived most of my life presenting as a male, and now I present exclusively as female. I identify as female. I had to go through puberty twice, one as a teenager and once in my late 50s as I was transitioning. And for me, fortunately, it was a relatively brief period, and now I fall into the square peg or the round hole. But for individuals who are not on the binary, it is a much more complicated life that they live when it's in a society that has expectations of the binary. And so when you have people who are gender fluid, agender, bigender, non-binary gender, they will never fit within these little cookie cutter images of what a person should fit in, but their life is just as valuable. I mean, God made that child just like every other child. And I would really appreciate if any of the other panelists would like to add some commentary about, you know, the complexities and difficulties. If you're talking solely about sexual orientation, no one needs to know or see what your orientation is if you don't want to let them know. But as I've often said, the first time I walked my dogs in a dress in my neighborhood, people could obviously tell there was something different going on there. And to have the courage to live your authentic self is something that most people never actually have to experience. But, you know, particularly for those of us who find ourselves in the gender side of the LGBTQ area, it's much more difficult. Charlie, would you have some things you'd like to share with us?
You know, again, I go back to being born and raised here and trying to transition. And so there were, you know, a few years where I would, you know, run into a classmate or run into someone in the grocery store and duck down the other aisle because I was embarrassed for them to see the changes that was going. And so I had to grow into myself, and I had to grow into my, to be comfortable. You know, Charlottesville is not all peaches and cream. And I'm sure a lot of people want to paint it that way, but it's not. It's a difficult town to live in as an African American because there's either one side of the spectrum or the other, and that, you know, the middle class person suffers greatly, and then you have the whole African American experience of belief of the burning in hell, and so it's difficult. It's difficult for anybody to transition. For me, I can only speak and tell you that it was even more difficult as African American to transition in a smaller town. I think in a larger town, I could have just kind of gone into the baseboards and not exist, but I do exist here. And so it took a few years for me to be able to be comfortable, to be able to just finally say to hell with it. This is who I am. And if you don't like it, then that's not my problem. But I had to grow into that comfortability to be able to walk down the street with my head up high.
Charlie, thank you for sharing that. You really bring up an important area of this, and that's privilege. And, you know, I know that I was very blessed with the privilege of being born as the Caucasian in America, into an intact family that was able to financially support me and help me get through my education, and then basically build a career as a successful male. And now step down in terms of the way many people in society would look at it, from a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male to a transgender woman. I think transgender individuals of color, however, have a substantially greater challenge in front of them. Faith often works against our ability to live our authentic selves. And this goes back to my appreciation with Equality Virginia, your Transgender Advocacy Speakers Bureau. Having the conversation within faith communities has been very helpful. Amy, Sarah, Lisa, do you have any other thoughts with this sort of the privilege and the whole umbrella aspect of transgender?
Well, we,
Lisa?
so I'm in a unique situation. I've worked my whole life with, if you don't like it, you know, too bad. I don't, we in the LGBTQ community, we kind of talk about this in the sense of pass, right? You can pass for straight. I've never really passed for straight. So it's one of those where I walk through life as, you know, and there comes that dyke or whatever that people want to say. And it's a constant situation where I'm in you know, I walk into a restroom or not to a restroom. And I think that's where some of that discrimination we're going to need to talk about into our businesses. I mean, I've been told to get out of a restroom more than once, and I don't identify as transgender or maybe even not non-binary. That for someone of my age and coming from North Alabama, these are new hopes to look at oneself. I had someone ask me one time, and this is something I hear a lot. Why would you know? This is your choice. It's your choice to live this way. And I simply looked at them and said, why would anyone choose to be discriminated against? Why would anyone choose to be harassed? Why would I choose, and this was many years back, but why would I choose not to be able to walk down the street and hold my partner's hand? And why would I choose, if I did that, why would I choose to be subject to being assaulted? And so what folks, I think, still are not just grasping in, and this is, you know, we live in a great time and age where there are a lot more services for people, especially our youth. This is, you know, because if it was a choice, probably some people might choose to be a different color. Some people might choose because it's easy, right? Or some people might choose, okay, great, I choose to be straight, so I don't have to deal with any of this. I can walk through my life all day long and choose to love who I don't have to worry about being discriminated against. I don't have to worry about walking to a restroom and people, you know, looking at me trying to figure out, are you a man or a woman? And I identify, as just me. I don't identify as transgender, so I can't imagine what it's like to identify as transgender and have that same, especially for our youth. So I am, I said this the other day, while I am comforted by these new laws, I still hold my breath. I still know we have so much work to do in the schools. I still know we have so much work, and we've got a lot of, as Amy Sarah said, we've got a lot of great teachers and great principals who are open to these ideas and open to inclusivity and intersectionality. But we have some folks who are not. And I want to just talk real briefly, V, what you said, and we talk about privilege. We need to make sure that we've got the services and numbers for people to reach out for people who don't have the means to get an attorney, because that's privilege. And the discrimination that's happening to folks right now are you know, are transgender people of color who probably do not have the means to hire an attorney. I don't want people to think that they don't have an opportunity to get help from being discriminated against or kicked out of housing because of their means. So if that's another conversation for another time, then we need to have it, but we need to make sure that we've got services and we give at least a number for people to call so that we can, so that people without the means to hire an attorney, because some people won't even make that phone call because they think they've got to have a retainer of $450 the first hour. And that's just completely unattainable. I mean, folks are still looking for their, how am I going to have food on the table tomorrow? $450 might as well be $1 million. And so I want us to make sure that we have that, and again, this is probably another discussion for another time, but our law enforcement. I know that we had I know that another law passed about hate crimes that included laws to protect LGBTQ people, but we have got to have the training for our police departments to understand that now in this Commonwealth of Virginia.
Boy, you brought up some really good things. Passing is such an interesting term, and historically it has been used in areas far beyond the transgender world. I can think back to times when light-skinned African American out of jobs in private organizations, and passing is such an interesting term anyway. I personally don't like it. I don't pass as a woman. I am a woman. I'm a transgender woman. But not everyone will. There are people who will never pass as what any other people think they should be or look like or how they should act. They are just who they are. I really appreciate you bringing up the law enforcement side of this. I've been in a number of conversations and communications with Chief Lance of the Albemarle County Police Department specifically about, a number of things that are sweeping the country right now in terms of law enforcement. Black Lives Matter. Arguments to defund the police, which means different things to different people, to eliminate school resource officers. And Albemarle County Police Department was very responsive in getting back to me and ensuring that they are very proactive in ensuring that both in the hiring, the training, and the expectations of law enforcement, that they will hire the right people, train them properly, and if they don't live up to the expectations, they will not be retained in the police force. Every resident, every visitor in our county needs to know that they will be treated with dignity and respect by law enforcement without regard to their sex, their race, gender, national origin, ethnicity, religion, any of those things. And those are really good points to bring up. And as you mentioned, we now have hate crime legislation, which is a very different situation than simply charging something under an assault and battery sort of an offense. Any other questions coming from our viewers? We've had a couple come in, principally about housing. But if you've got other questions, and one of the things I've also thought about as we've gone, well into our presentation here today, is I think we've sort of presumed that people listening in will understand the components of a person as they relate to this area, sex being your anatomy, sexual orientation, who you're attracted to, and there can be a physical sexual orientation as well as an emotional sexual orientation, presentation, gender identity. All of these are things that those of us on the panel have lived with for most of our lives. Lisa, you mentioned a little bit about how you identify, you think of yourself. I remember when I came out to my older sister, and of course she was surprised, like most of my family was. And I said, I don't know how to explain it, but I've always just felt like I should be a girl. And she said, I don't know what you mean by that. I just am. But for most of my life, living as a male, identifying as female, I just never felt like I was the right person. And only after I transitioned have I now been able to just be me. And I don't think of myself as, Donna, a transgender woman. I'm just Donna, and I'm able to live myself. And it goes back to what you were talking about specifically, Lisa, And B, what you were talking about in terms of protecting our students to allow them to grow and learn as who they are, makes them a much more productive and valuable member of society, because they can contribute and live as an authentic person.
And I think it's important to note possibly here that because there is this perception that you can tell if somebody is trans or if they're gay, like Lisa was talking about, how she can't pass. As somebody who often can pass, sometimes to my chagrin, it's important for employers or people in any sort of power, and as they're looking at these issues, to not assume that they don't have people in the LGBTQ community working for them or as colleagues and clients and things. We live in a society where we make snap judgments about people, and we make assumptions, and we have to be really careful because I mean, I've had people, it's one of those things where I was listening to somebody of color who often passed as not being of color, and hearing how people would talk to him and say horrible things about people of color. And he's sitting there thinking, you don't know who you're talking to. And so I really just want people to remember that every time you interact with somebody, you need to put the assumptions aside, because there is not, we do not walk around with a little label that says what and who we are and how we want to be treated. And so you need to ask people, and there's a lot that goes into learning how to speak without assumptions. So using sir and ma'am without really looking and without asking somebody what their pronouns are, how do they like to be referred to. Things like that, which is why we do the Safe Civil training, to go through a lot of the minutia of how to interact with folks without those assumptions. And then the other thing too I want to add is that as somebody who does tend to pass, it doesn't mean that everything's groovy, in the sense that I do always have the question in mind, like, do I need to say something? Did I not say something? Should I have said something? Am I being not courageous? All of those things. So there is that inner stress that also can happen to individuals. And then finally, I just wanted to make a brief point that the gender binary and the way our culture tries to keep people in these neat boxes of male and female, it doesn't just affect members of the LGBTQ community, it affects everybody. When I'm working with folks who identify as cisgender and straight, normal, everybody has had experiences of being slapped down for expressing themselves. Like if a man cries or a woman is too loud, we have ideas about gender that are so fixed and restrictive that hurts everybody. It doesn't just hurt people in the LGBTQ community, though it's much more exacerbated there. But understanding gender and the way our culture has been very restrictive, it does affect everybody. And when you are asking people like, why are you choosing to dress like this or look like this? We're all making choices. Even if you dress according to the norm of that matches your gender, you're making a choice to do that. And I just want to just point that out as well. So I think it's interesting.
Thanks, Amy. Sarah, there's another thing about passing. When I was preparing to move to Albemarle County, a number of my friends in my previous location of residence said, and the best thing is once you get there, no one needs to know you're transgender because you just look just like a woman. And if you think about that, think of the negative context that said about me, that I should somehow be ashamed of this part of who I am. And Lisa, I want to go back to something you mentioned, which was very important about having resources available to individuals, and particularly in the transgender community. You spoke frequently about attorneys, which is very important because, I've got a 3-inch binder full of all of the legal stuff I had to go through as part of my transition. But another thing is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. Part of the standards of care is to have evaluation or time with a counselor or psychologist to ensure that gender identity is really the issue that you're dealing with and not something else, because some of the surgeries cannot be performed unless you've met some of the standards of care. And that's another thing where privilege comes in so important. Fortunately, under the Affordable Care Act, more healthcare providers were providing transgender coverage. Now, under our Virginia Act, we're going to have those sort of protections. But there's still a cost associated with much of the things that we have to deal with. V, can you talk a little bit more about the healthcare protections for transgender individuals?
Sure. I'm happy to do that. And also realizing how much airtime I am taking up as well, and kind of wanted to go back, if I may deviate from our panel flow for just a second, just to also kind of reiterate something that we have touched on. And yeah, something that we have touched on, I think. And so when we're talking about the impact of these non-discrimination protections, whether it be in businesses or housing, or for example, with protecting LGBTQ students, highlighting the fact that, for example, in schools, LGBTQ youth do experience higher rates of discrimination and harassment, violence than their heterosexual cisgender peers. And also, when we look at the rates of discrimination experienced when we add in race, LGBTQ youth of color disproportionately experience even higher rates of discrimination and violence than their white LGBTQ peers. And so as we talk about the implementation of creating safer schools, it's important to remember that additional layer of how racism combined with homophobia, combined with transphobia, disproportionately negatively impact LGBTQ students of color in Virginia and across the Commonwealth. And so when we look at creating safer and more inclusive schools, we have to layer in as well conversations about how racism is disproportionately impacting LGBTQ students. And the same is true when we look at non-discrimination protections in housing, employment, public spaces. Again, yes, LGBTQ people, white LGBTQ people do experience discrimination, are fired unfairly from their jobs, are passed over for promotion, are kicked out of their houses, are treated differently when they apply for an apartment. Are denied service. And then when we layer in race and we look at those rates of discrimination experienced by LGBTQ people of color, specifically Black LGBTQ people, again, those rates are much, much, much higher. And so as we talk about this great work, and as we talk about implementation, we must continue to center the lives and voices and experiences of LGBTQ people of color, and especially Black LGBTQ people, especially Black trans women who are killed at a rate that is and has been called epidemic. And I just wanted to center that, and also cede my time back to Charlie, because he has done some incredible work with Black Trans Men Inc. and then also the fraternity, the statewide fraternity that he's a part of. I know so many great men who are part of that fraternity, and you all do great work. And just wanted to see, what can the rest of us do to help support the work that you are doing with both of these groups, Charlie?
Oh, thanks, V. So I'll clarify, I'm not with any of the fraternities, just Black trans men and
Okay.
One of the biggest issues that we're seeing right now is that Black Trans Men Incorporated, we need to implement mental health care. And we saw that by a young gentleman by the name of Tony McDade. Back at the end of May, Tony pretty much did a manifesto on Facebook Live that he had been beaten by 5 men because of his transgender status down in Florida. and he went after those men and felt that he would probably more than likely be killed by the police, and that's exactly what happened. As you listen to Tony's live video, there were so many things that, so many services and resources that he needed that he probably would have been here today. And so what we see is that in the trans community, not only educating the police departments on who we are and how to treat us, so so that law enforcement understands, but there's this ignorance of who trans people really are in this society. And so the only way to treat ignorance is by educate. And sometimes you've got to be able to throw it in people's faces, whether they want to hear it or not. And so these kinds of venues are excellent for people to see that, here I am, a trans man that gets up and goes to work every day. And I live my life, but there are also so many other trans people of color that aren't able to get the services that they need. So the biggest thing that I see right now for trans people of color is the mental health and the alcohol and the recovery aspect of things. There's a lot of alcohol and drug abuse that's rampant in the trans community. There's HIV. We did a campaign back right when COVID hit, we being Black Trans Men Incorporated, where we sent out about 500 what we call COVID relief kits. And in the COVID relief kits was mask and sanitizer. But one of the things that was kind of mind blowing for me was we needed to put condoms and safe sex items in these relief kits, because you have a lot of people out here that are still doing the sex workers. And this is where they have to, sadly enough, resort to be able to put food on the table and live. And so in America, that shouldn't be. That just shouldn't be. We shouldn't, we just got to educate. We've got to educate everybody. Everybody's got, I'm just going to put it this way. Black Americans and Black trans people and Black LGBTQ people, period, has been comfortable sitting at your table all our lives. We've had to. We've got to get the other part of America to be comfortable sitting at our own table. And I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Charlie. V, you mentioned the housing, and it reminded me when I moved to the area, I realized that the apartment complex where I had applied for an apartment and could well afford could have turned down my application simply because I'm transgender. And Charlie, what you bring up, at least as of a few years ago, the average post-transition annual income for a transgender person in America was under $15,000 a year, not because we're not competent, not because we're not capable, but because people were refusing to hire us. And when you can't support yourself through regular employment, that's what leads many people into the sex trade. It's what turns a lot of people into substance abuse, alcohol, and drugs. And it just adds to society's problems as opposed to simply allowing people to live as they truly are. I'd like to ask the panelists, where do we go from here? Martin Luther King famously asked that. He also said that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I will tell you that the last couple of weeks, with the passage of these laws in Virginia and the Bostick case coming out, has that arc moving a little closer to justice in my view. But we have a long way to go. We have a lot of policies that are still out there and opposing us. So I'd just like to go down each of our panelists. And Lisa, I'm going to start with you. Where do you see the next steps that we need to go on in terms of LGBTQ protection?
Awareness and education. I mean, I think that's where I think the silence that sometimes we just talked about passing, just staying silent. I mean, Harvey Milk said, "I will not stay silent." But I think that's where, with these protections, if we can raise more voices and have more voices come forward, and then have education. I think here in the county, with us starting this affinity group and having we're going to have a lot of components of education within this group. I think that is where we start. I do think having the resources and the availability to resources would be another way for us to move forward.
Thank you. Amy, Sarah, what do you see as our next steps?
Unmute myself. I think that it is basically what Lisa said. I think we need to, as a community in terms of the Charlottesville Albemarle community and our surrounding counties, I think we need to be proactive and in our inclusion. And that means that employers need to have anti-discrimination policies, and they need to post them, and they need to educate about them and educate themselves, and they need to live by them. A policy that you have that nobody knows exists doesn't exist. And I see that a lot of people like to pay lip service to policies and not actually enact them or live them, though well-meaning. I think that in our education, our schools, I'm excited about the transgender guidance coming down with the law, but I'd really like to see a very active and firm commitment to training all teachers and all staff. I mean, and that includes intersectionality and looking at and race, because the two are so tied for kids in our area. I know my kids in elementary school heard we need to focus on all ages and senior citizens too, who often get left in the wash. So there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of really looking at all the areas of a person's journey through life and how we can support and include people's experiences.
Thank you, Amy, Sarah. Charlie?
So, this is Pride Month, and, I always have to think that the reason we have Pride Month is not because people back at Stonewall wanted to march up and down the street and look pretty. Pride was because some Black transgender women said enough is enough, and it was started as a protest and a riot and bodies broken. That's what the starter was about. And so I think, where do we go from here? It's nice to have me, but you need to have other Black trans people of color that are a little different than I am and a little more raw than I can be, which I don't know if you can get to that, but you need to hear from all aspects of what trans people go through, from the trans youth that are laying out on the street because they can't find a place to live, they've been kicked out. I think we need to get a lot more different types of people around the table so that Charlottesville and society truly see what trans people of color are going through. And Amy Sarah is right. There's the homophobic slurs, there's the transphobic slurs, but also the majority of the time, if you're a person of color, that's going to be the first slur that you hear. And so we're in a very good situation right now, despite the lives that have been lost, because some kind of mysterious way, we're all fighting for a common cause right now. And I guess the powers to be just said, I'm finally fed up with the BS, and I'm just going to do this so that we can try to get on one accord. And so I think while we're on this one accord, let's not next year be forgotten about what has happened. Let's continue to have these town halls. Let's continue to have this. I want to get to understand you, because that's the importance. That's the basic thing. When I was re-invited back to Charlottesville Pride, it wasn't because I run my mouth too much. It's because they want to hear a different voice. They want to see, they want to look at the glasses through a different lens. And so I think that's what we all need to do. We need to educate everyone on every end of the spectrum.
Thank you, Charlie. V, what is Equality Virginia? What's on your plate for this upcoming legislative session?
Sure. Just wanted to also echo my other panelists' voices. And then also to say that, yeah, there's a lot more work to be done. It's interesting. I've had kind of a range of conversation with folks, some who are like, great, non-discrimination protections are in place. We're good, right? And we're good in some ways, but of course, other conversations that I have are people kind of rolling up their sleeves. Okay, great. You know, we've got our hand on the first rung of the ladder. Let's keep going. Let's keep going. There's so much more to be done. There truly is. And in so many ways, the achievements that we have had this legislative session should be celebrated, are historic. I think will be a blueprint for other states, especially here in the South, as they continue to create more inclusive states for LGBTQ people, especially because the majority of LGBTQ people in this country are living and raising families in the South, and this work is so important here. So I do want to center where we are in the country in this context. And certainly more needs to be done, especially as we think about deepening and widening the scope and the focus of our work, as we continue to talk about the experiences of LGBTQ people of color, and how those experiences are different than white LGBTQ people. For example, right now in Richmond, rates of HIV infection are disproportionately impacting Black men who have sex with men, and especially actually here in Richmond. And unfortunately, there are still HIV criminalization laws on the books. And this just really, really negatively impacts people, and we need to address that. We need to modernize HIV law here in the Commonwealth, and so we will be working in coalition actually with some folks who have been doing that work. The Echo VA Coalition has been doing that advocacy work for years, and we are really proud to be partnering with them to move HIV modernization legislation for this year. Charlie also mentioned that LGBTQ youth, especially LGBTQ youth of color, are, experiencing homelessness, disproportionately make up the number of people who are in out-of-home care, who are in foster care and adoption agencies. And so what does it look like to then update law around providing non-discrimination protections and safety for LGBTQ youth in those systems, and then also for LGBTQ families who are interested in opening their doors and fostering or adopting. So yeah, that's just a little bit, a tip of the iceberg. And we certainly want to hear from the community. Equality Virginia wants to know what are Virginia LGBTQ people's priorities. What do folks want to see addressed next at the state legislature? So we'll be sending out a community survey here in the next few weeks to gather that information and to help inform our legislative priority work as we move and start prepping for the 2021 session.
Thank you, V. I want to thank our panelists today, Charlie Burton, Lisa Green, Amy Sarah Marshall, and of course, V. Lamneck from Equality Virginia for joining us. I think what is important is that as many people of the LGBTQ community as possible live open and notorious lives as who they are. But I also recognize that as with much of my life, 25 years in the Navy and the first law firm I went with after I retired from the Navy, they would have all fired me had they known that I was transgender or thought that I was transgender. And what we need allies, because no minority group ever achieves success without the support of the majority. In the civil rights era, it was things like Bloody Sunday that turned and opened the eyes of white Americans to the plight of Black Americans. And that was what started to change and actually make some of the progress that we have achieved, and we need to do more there as well. So we're calling on you, our friends, our family members, our colleagues, our neighbors, to support us and to protect us so that we can then help support and protect you in the ways that we can. We were set up for about 2 hours, but I don't want to prolong the conversation. So I want to thank Albemarle County and Scottsville Pride for putting this together. It's been my pleasure as the supervisor for the Scottsville Magisterial District on the Albemarle County Board of Supervisors to be a part of this. And I am so thankful to be a part of this historic record-setting era for the lives of all Americans. Thank you all very much. And thank you. I want to also thank our viewers. We had a number of people express their appreciation for our forum today. Please don't hesitate to follow up with us. Let us know your questions and let us know where we can help. Thank you all and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.